Hello, welcome back to the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno, 89 to 96. And we have finally reached the end of 1995, starting this time with Bill Laswell. Curated and produced by Laswell, but expanded to a kind of various artists collective, the third Divination album, Akasha, is a continuation and development of the project. Once again working with artists away from the ambient scene, DXT, Japanese jazz musicians Hiromi Hosono and Yasuaki Shimizu, one-time Swans drummer Anton Fier, and as always Mick Harris, Laswell finds himself outside any trends, instead ploughing his own obscure furrow. Disc 1 consists of 4 minimal drone pieces, alternately bright and dark. They're as good as any in the Divination catalogue. Disc 2 starts in similar form but suddenly cuts into jungle. Yes, this is the beatless disc, rhythmic disc format here. Navigations melds electro breaks with free jazz in a track unlike anything I've covered so far. Laswell was keen to take on new sounds and influences, and jungle and drum and bass will become keen parts of his language going forward. If you're fond of 15-minute slabs of super fast breakbeats, the second disc is for you. Laswell has always worked on many projects throughout 95, a number of them containing dub and ambient elements, but all veering so heavily into isolationism and or murky Ilbian to be covered by the scope of this series. His collaboration with Terra Thamelitz Web may be of some interest. Having launched with a series of albums steeped in an idiosyncratic minimalism, April Records began 1995 in less convincing territory with UFO's The Soundtrack. If I was feeling cruel, and I might be, I'd say having set up a record label and released some planned albums, April's owners found themselves in need of more material to release and discovered they'd only received a couple of demos, the better of which was still sadly 2 guys with a synth and a tape recorder who'd recorded 50 minutes of themselves messing around, and misguidedly thinking that they made an amazing album, sent it to the address on the cover of that brilliant compilation one of them bought the previous year. A cover was knocked up for the pricey sum of 7p, and hooray, a gap in the schedule was filled. Look, it's obviously not true. April were a professional outfit, and the 2 artists involved here have gone on to have pretty successful careers with various projects. But this album is the epitome of amateur. Nasty synth presets, cheap drum machines, unoriginal structures, no melodic sense. It's possibly the worst album I've given serious attention to in this series so far. And whoever's distributing the album digitally seems to care for it about as much as I do. The cover looks like it's been upscaled from a 100 by 100 pixel thumbnail, and the last track is covered in digital glitches. The fact that I've listened to this album more than once gives me a slight sense of embarrassment. UFO's Niels Run returns to his other project Swimwear Catalogue. Yes, seriously, Swimwear Catalogue. And thankfully the results are a lot better. Using Berlin School ambient trance sequencing and arpeggios as a base, the group layer on a decent range of samples from acoustic guitars to all array of spoken snippets. There are some nice compositions too. Tremens is a particular highlight, while the sound design and sampling sometimes heads into experimental territory such as the glitchy, chopped up voices of Tunnel. Sometimes the synths will have a kind of crudeness, the sort of blunt sounds one might expect from synth music artists of the 80s still releasing Berlin School at this point, found on labels like Groove Unlimited, and the frankly naff cover is in line with that, but there's a genuine attempt at merging these very traditional sounds with more unusual textures that's admirable, even if the final result is merely okay and by no means essential. The Sonic Voyagers' Endless Mission is a fourth-rate Air Liquide rip-off with the worst album art ever made. After this bunch of less than inspiring releases, April put out the second in their Boredom is Deep and Mysterious compilation series. What I find very, very telling is that it features almost exactly the same artist as the first volume, and it's pretty good. The slightly lo-fi, intimate yet pleasingly atmospheric melodic minimalism of those 1994 April releases is present here on these tracks, and it's such a lovely sound that it makes me sad that they've put out a bunch of far less appealing records alongside this. Furry D by Dub Tractor is frankly gorgeous, while the gossamer strands of double muffled dolphins sound are in full force again, even if it's an incredibly gentle force. Release and acoustic offer gentle warmth backed by quiet clicky beats, while OPA even manages to make breakbeats sound like minimalist ambience. Okay, the dubby trip-hop of James Bong, dear God, is an odd way to close, mind you. And then there's Dawn at 6 by Future 3 with melancholic synths and crisp beats that sounds like twigs snapping. It's really quite beautiful and leads me to their debut album. The same kind of sound exists throughout We Are the Future 3, a mix of extremely crisp, minimal trip-hop and melancholic ambience. Feels very much like a record from a transitional period, not the sort of thing that would necessarily have existed the year before or the year after, but the emphasis on space and mood in the synths makes me want to include it here. Ronaldo is a highlight and exceptionally pretty piece of music that has few ideas but uses them immaculately. This and the second compilation really are April records at their best. As far as the big names go, 1995 brought back a return of the Orb, with their first conventional album in 3 years. Having signed to Island and released a live album and a mini-album, Patterson was dismayed to find neither actually counted towards the group's multi-album contract with the label. Not a great start, especially as they'd escaped big live due to disagreements there. After the deliberately obtuse and strikingly uncommercial Pommes Frites, which had sailed into the top 10 on good faith alone, the Orb's casual fanbase had swiftly departed, meaning album number 3, or 4 or 5, stalled at number 20, only just above the somewhat niche Live 93, and dropped out of the top 100 within a month. For an album as unusual as Orbus Terrarum, number 20 is actually pretty good, but it marked a commercial dip that they would never recover from. Similarly, critics were far less favourable this time around, with a mixture of complaints including both the album being self-indulgent abstraction and being more of the same. Not sure how that works. In truth, both critics and audiences are fickle beasts, and their responses are usually more indicative of how they felt about the previous release than the current one. And anyway, Ambient was going out of fashion, and no artists would be lighting up the charts in the same way they did in the first half of the decade. The legacy of the album, however, is much more positive, and Orbus Terrarum is frequently cited as the band's masterpiece. Combining the more abstract and heavily textured sounds of Pommes Frites with the hypnotic repetition and dub grooves of their earlier records, Patterson and co here create an album that avoids the spacey cliches, whimsical moments and occasionally crude sampling of their earlier records, resulting in a stunningly beautiful ambient work that projects imagery as vivid as other albums in the genre. From the ancient maps on the cover to titles like Plateau, Valley and Oxbow Lakes, it's clear that this is earthbound music, the kind that explores distant exotic landscapes in detail. Again, avoiding the obvious approaches of rainforests and flutes that had become old hat long before this point, the Orb instead come up with microscopic details and stitch them together into sonic foliage that's irresistible to explore. Opening pair, Valley and Plateau, developed significantly since their debuts on Live 93, are maybe the best tracks here or anywhere else in the group's catalogue. With no attempt to woo audiences after an immediate hit, instead these tracks invite the listener in to investigate them in detail and repeat listens. I'm still hearing new sounds to this day. Oxbow Lakes throws in some wonderful and strange piano from Alex before falling apart into walls of cacophonous sound and descending slightly menacing synth lines. The only single from the album, and frankly they had a good job even spotting this on such an unpopular record, it crawled into the charts at 38, back with some decent remixes, including a lovely orchestrated version by Instrumental, who would go on to work with Orbital. Getting a track as odd as this into the top 40 is impressive, but less so given that FSOL's equally uncommercial The Far Out Son of Lung and The Ramblings of the Madman followed a few weeks later, peaking much higher at number 22. The Orb were clearly out of fashion. With synth arpeggios and an array of gurgling and hissing sounds thrown through dub delays, Montandor is suddenly invaded by heavy breakbeats and feedback. The infamous snare from Metallica's St. Anger sounds like it makes its debut here, in the album's most confrontational note, while White River Junction's shuffling rhythms, spiky melodies and jigsaw of samples are the closest the Orb ever came to really sounding like their contemporaries and oft-compared FSOL. The 17-minute slug dub, cut to 16 for the CD, is the nearest thing to earlier Orb that one can find here, although even then the drums clatter and slam like a live performance in a church hall, rather than the smoothly compressed sound of UF Orb. It's a strangely warts and all approach, but it works. Striking the perfect balance between experimentation and consistency, ambience and dub, texture and melody, Orbus Terrarum is the Orb album to go to for visceral atmosphere and texture, easily the most ambient the group would sound in the 90s. For this album, the main trio of the Orb was Alex, Thrash and Thomas Fellman. Valley features Perpetual Dawn co-writer Simon Phillips and Another Fine Day's Tom Green once again. Other occasional collaborators reappearing include BJ Cole, Nick Burton and Paul Ferguson. I suppose I should also talk about Thrash. Chris Weston left the Orb somewhere around the point the album was largely completed but mostly unmixed. He's cited numerous reasons for his dissatisfaction, mostly centred around believing he was doing most of the work but going uncredited and even underpaid for it. By all accounts there does seem to be some truth to his complaints about the contractual side of things, and he's not been treated well in the intervening years. Since a rather lengthy tirade online in 2015, he's become mostly known for his complaints about the band and Alex in general, stating that Alex never actually contributed musically to the Orb and suggested that he and Fellman are, well, not very nice people. Now, I do have my reservations about the Orb, and like many, I found it easy to believe that there was a fair amount of truth in this at the time. That said, while I do think that when he puts on his COD reggae dub sound system Mon hat, Alex unfailingly looks like a prat, he never comes across as anything other than a truly decent bloke in interviews. He might well have been a bit arrogant at the band's peak, but find me someone in that position who didn't. And he admits himself that he's not a musician, but he's also clearly a great producer, curator, sample spotter and ideas man, the kind of person who knows how to gather together the right people at the right time to help create the right sounds he's come up with in his head. Ultimately, Weston would have come across far better and more believable if he'd taken the attention he got from his initial complaint and said, "I've been wronged, but now I'm going to use that as a base to start afresh and show that I can produce some great stuff by myself." Instead, he's just continued to make increasingly nasty remarks about the Orb and complain about other things in general, to the extent that he's decided he won't be sharing any music with anyone. I hope he's able to find some peace in some way, because framing a significant part of your existence around hating someone from your past isn't healthy. Thrash mix, Occidental and Slug dub before he left. The rest of the album was mixed by Andy Hughes, who came on board here and became Patterson's partner in crime for the next few Orb releases. Even though I do find some truth in Weston's belief that he was the musical core of the group, largely down to the fact that UF Orb and Orbus Terrarum are my favourite Orb records, and I think there was a massive drop off in quality after he left, I also think those two are the worst sounding tracks on the album, lacking the subtlety and beauty of the first 5. So things are never cut and dry. A limited edition CD version came out first, packaged in a textured card sleeve slotted into a semi-transparent plastic outer that's a lovely object in itself. The full-length version of the album has only ever been released on vinyl, running as it does to 81 minutes. 2008's expanded 2CD edition features some interesting alternate takes and mixes, but nothing to write home about. Despite the major shift in the band's lineup, the Orb would start to work on their 4th proper album not long after Orbus Terrarum was released, although it would take a lot longer than normal to surface. FSOL I spoke about in the 1994 videos, their 95 album ISDN being a reissue of December 94's initial limited edition release with a slight alteration to the tracklist. The reissue was promoted by the single off The Far Out Son of Lung, a pretty uncommercial piece of aggressive trip-hop that fronted a video EP featuring all 5 of the singles tracks, their familiar computer imagery largely supplanted by live action footage of the band in the Mediterranean, their friend nearly drowning, and clips from WSH, an eerie TV movie they'd soundtracked the previous year. Otherworldly beauty this was not. After promoting ISDN's reissue with an essential mix of industrial funk, dub, trip-hop and psych rock, they disappeared from the broader world for a year, but did make a couple of transmissions before the end of '95, a John Peel session and a broadcast to an art and technology festival in Barcelona. Both sets featured exclusively new material, and it seemed like they were doubling down on their more recent sounds, trip-hop beats, plenty of electric guitars, even moments of big beat and jungle. Other than one track, the eerie Vit Drowning, synths were almost entirely absent. Just over a year after Lifeforms was released, and FSOL had seemingly abandoned ambient for good. Global Communication released no new material in 1995, other than an EP of jungle under the name The Chameleon, but they did capitalise on the popularity of 7614 with an album of remixes, slightly irritatingly featuring crossover with other releases, 2 tracks from Pentamerous Metamorphosis, 1 bizarrely an original track from Reload's A Collection of Short Stories, and now one from the bonus disc of Transmissions. It nevertheless presents the pair as masters of richly emotive melodic ambient techno. The remix of Warp 69's Natural High is oddly jazzy, a strangely crossover between rich synth ambience and trip-hop. It doesn't quite work, but everything else is great. The remix of The Grid's Roller Coaster is incredible, easily 7614 worthy material, while Amor Real from John Anderson's Deseo remix is energetic and airy. Nav Katz's Wild Horses becomes a psychedelic swirling riot of synthetic sound which unusually fades out near the end for an extended outro of unaccompanied hip-hop beats. It's not quite as consistently great as the other Global Communication records, and those who own their other releases, as well as the excellent John Anderson disc, will find they're only missing the album's 2 weaker tracks anyway, making it maybe slightly superfluous. At the time though, it was no doubt an excellent collection for those relatively new to the group. Transform Clustered. Recorded during 1993 but not released until 95, the second and sadly final Transform album is massively overshadowed by the pair's debut. Released on the CNR label, one of Scandinavia's biggest and oldest labels dating back to the middle of the century, it ended up on their Big Sleep imprint, which appears to have only released this and one other album. It's also definitely not in the same league as Sublunar Oracles, although it has lots to recommend it. Aeons is a gorgeous ambient trance track, lovely sequences and shimmering beats, while Mana's oddly filtered synths and muffled speech combine to create a hugely atmospheric piece, and Entwine is a dark and dramatic closer. Throughout its runtime we get beatless synth explorations, chunky breakbeats, ambient techno rhythms, twinkling sequences, some melodies inviting, others darker. Had Clustered come out in 93, it probably would have been a minor classic. Instead, by 95 it feels a little bit anonymous. The ideas here used so frequently, and better a number of times, by a huge range of other artists. It's sad to think that the makers of such a fantastic debut ended up languishing in obscurity. Had Sublunar Oracles been given the attention it deserved, this might have ended up merely a strong second album in a lengthy career. Instead, Discogs speaks volumes. 67 people only album, no reviews or comments. A massive shame. Mind you, they did carry on for a few more years as Brain Pilot, with more dance floor oriented material. Second album, Mind Fuel, is actually less overtly techno sounding than the first, with some gorgeous melodic material such as on the crunchy opener Pilot Plant. Meanwhile, Sub-Level 3 is sinister synth drone with occasionally aggressive clangs. One of those albums that was mining a similar territory to the likes of Autechre and Locust at this point. Anyone interested in exploring more of the crossover point where ambient became IDM could do a lot worse than giving Brain Pilot's Mind Fuel a go. The uplifting Equilibriate is sure to delight any ambient fan. Neural Network, Modernité. A 75-minute 4-part composition, this second album by the Norwegian trio finds them heavily expanding on the ambient aspects of their sound, and beginning to move out of the shadow of Biosphere's influence. The first part is a gorgeous 25 minutes of melodic synth music beautifully produced. This continues into part 2 until around 6 minutes we get into some mellow acidic trance. The group's compositional skills have improved dramatically since their debut, and there's a lot to enjoy here. Part 3's down-tempo beats complement the further synth melodies, while Part 4 features a darker sound and some skeletal IDM rhythms. It's a beautiful and understated record, one which lacks the crudeness and overt influences of their first album, and is a very highly recommended example of the Arctic ambient sound. The CD came with a bonus disc featuring a 17-minute additional track called Crimson, a trance piece with some atmospheric pads, a track which is fine but not of the same quality as the main album. Sadly, this would be the final Neural Network album, with the group splitting after third album, Opaque, due to be released in 97, floundered in limbo as Belgian label Kicking Records closed down. While it wasn't offered to Origo remains unknown. This album was finally released on Rediscovery in 2023, along with some EPs collecting tracks from their various releases. Lars Christian Sander and Oddgeir Hvidsson went on to create house music as Motion Control, while Jostein Dag Gjelsvik would form the ambient techno duo Circular with Bjart Andriasen and go on to have a lot more success in the process. One-time Yes singer John Anderson released the World Fusion album Deseo in 1994 on renowned new age label Windham Hill, and followed it up with a remix album the following year, the Deseo Remixes. For this he commissioned Deep Forest, FSOL, Global Communication and Trans-Global Underground to rework the entire album into entirely new pieces. Deep Forest's 2 tracks are by this point very dated trancey techno, and both placed near the front do their best to turn discerning listeners off. Trans-Global Underground's first track is a slightly crude techno piece, but their other 2 are decent dubby tracks. The real draw is the FSOL and Global Communication material. FSOL's Deseo Reconstruction is a surprise return to the sound of their 1993 remixes, an epic with tribal drums and vast emotive sampling, though it does contain a little of ISDN's darkness thrown in. Global Communication bring Amor Real, as heard on their remix album, and the beautiful Bless This, which morphs Anderson's distinctive vocals into layers of choral drone and is one of their finest tracks. The last 4 pieces on the Deseo remixes are excellent and would make a brilliant 35-minute EP. The opening section is less worthwhile. Species of Fishes, Songs of a Dumb World. A Russian trio whose debut Songs of a Dumb World was released in 95 and combines ambient, acid, techno and experimental sound design, sometimes within the same track. Tak, Tar, Sh, Sh, and Numworld are superb examples of 90s ambient, while these titles throws together sample-based ambient house and crunchy IDM in the same breath. It has its odd moments, and the swerves into techno can be slightly jarring, but it's an appealing and admirably experimental record. The album was released on vinyl in 2023, with bonus tracks, some unreleased, some from the 2000 sequel Songs of a Dumb World Part 2. Ambient 7, Escape. Despite the kind of name I generally object to, Japanese trio Ambient 7 actually make really rather lovely music. Very melodic, laid back, with chunky but unobtrusive beats and vocal chant samples, even some saxophone. It borders on the down-tempo chill-out end of things, but ultimately the melodic aspects are evocative enough to keep it ambient. Full moon fashions, full moon fashions. Enter Electrolux, one of the rare labels to carry on in the spirit of the ambient techno era, if not quite the sound of it. This German label formed in 1995 and carried on right through to around 2018. They branched out into a lot of styles over the years, but atmospheric ambient techno was a frequent appearance. Full Moon Fashions was the first album on the label, and it does a decent job of defining the sound of the time. With influence from the more minimal direction European techno was taking at the time, the music is cool and calculated, but with the same expert use of reverb and gorgeous melodies as earlier ambient techno styles. As much to do with later styles like dub techno, the album nevertheless offers a lot for fans of early 90s ambient, and signals a way the sound could continue in part well beyond what had been considered its sell-by date. Aural Float's debut Introspectives was the second release, and operates in similar territory with dubbier moments and broadly less intense sounding beats. Transambient Communications, Praze-an-Beeble. An interesting crossover with psychedelic rock that works because of its dedication to the ambient sound. Solid analogue synth melodies, field recordings, drum loops and some odd samples are all very much in the ambient house vein, and it's clear that this wasn't just a half-arsed case of let's throw in a synth line and call it ambient. Ocean Waves at Sunset is a gorgeous piece, its relaxation vibes undercut brilliantly by radio being tuned, throwing in some wonderful sound collage elements. As long as you don't mind some electric guitar in your ambient house, Praze-an-Beeble comes highly recommended. And yes, I'm getting as bored with album covers featuring Mandelbrot sets as you are. Aural Expansion, Surreal Sheep. We've now hit the point where a lot of designers are really trying to be the Designer's Republic, the messy but sterile look becoming a very common style for the next couple of years. Yoni Alkio's Aural Expansion only released 2 albums, 1993's surprisingly forward-thinking IDM Exercises and Expansion, and 1995's slightly more ambient-leaning Surreal Sheep. This record offers up a very minimal, glitchy kind of ambient techno that feels slightly ahead of its time. The overall feel isn't too different from countless other ambient techno albums of the era, but close listening reveals hints of the glitch and clicks and cuts sound of the next few years nestled within the rhythm tracks. Its partner album, Remixed Sheep, features reworkings by a number of pretty big names, including Wagenchrist, Mixmaster Morris, Music and Mark Bell, plus a couple of exclusive tracks. Wagenchrist feels closer to the ambient IDM of his debut than his usual trip-hop style, while Morris's is an unusual glitchy trip-hop version. Airwaves, Second Shift. This second volume of achingly beautiful melodic ambient music from Mexican producer Oscar Menzel comes almost as highly recommended as his first. This time he includes more in the way of rhythm in the form of down-tempo sampled loops. Waveform's use of some terrible new age presets knocks a point or two off the final score, but overall it's another set of truly gorgeous synth ambient. Sadly, this would be the last album he released in his lifetime. By his death in 2012 he hadn't released any new music in 17 years. 2 albums of unreleased material have been released posthumously on Carpe Sonum. Human Beings, For the Time Being. Pleasant if unremarkable ambient house. Elements of dub, Berlin School, trip-hop, acid and ambient trance can be found throughout. Final 3 tracks, Vermilion Sands, The Pattern and For the Time Being are all excellent, but the first half of the album sounds like a group still finding their sound. Their second album, They Live, was released a few months later and consists of live recordings from a tour with Sensorial and Speedy J. Unsurprisingly, it heads into more trancey techno territory and the group sound much more confident with this sound. It would however be their final album. Synaesthesia, the tribal ambient techno project of Frontline Assembly and Delirium's Bill Lieb and Reese Fulber. Synaesthesia released 2 albums in 1995. The first, Embody, uses slightly more overtly industrial sounds in its rhythms, giving quite a harsh texture to some of the tracks. With the use of vocal samples and Eastern sounding arpeggiated melodies, it will probably appeal somewhat to fans of Psydub and the like. Now, Lieb and Fulber have never denied being fans of FSOL, but this album does sample life forms rather liberally. So much so that in places one might well be listening to a remix album. Door to the Other Side features 4 overt samples in itself. Still, FSOL weren't exactly averse to sampling either, so I'm sure they don't mind. Desideratum is more trancey in its sound, full of arpeggios and with overall less sample-based and more synthetic sound, but with fewer dance elements, the industrial techno beats of opening track Andromeda aside. A haunting 2+ hours of deep ethnic tribal dark ambience, it's melodic and richly textured and utterly brilliant. It even ends on the emotive Tubastra aria, giving it a surprisingly hopeful coda. Spyra. Homelistening is killing clubs. Like many on the trance-adjacent end of things, Wolfram Spyra began his career within industrial. By the mid-90s, and this, his debut album, he had switched to more ambient sound, and arpeggios of his amusingly titled debut are reminiscent of Berlin School artists like Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze. Some pieces have beats, Pedigree Tribe is chunky down-tempo trance for example, while others are pure synth work like the stunning closer Future of the Past. He hasn't quite reached the level of his later Fax albums yet, but there are mature ideas and excellent production here that make it a fine debut. Meridian Dream How About Now? One-off project from engineer Ray DeLeo and one-time member of early goth outfit Dance Society, Meridian Dream's sound is a mixture of tribal ambient, spacey ambient techno and trance elements, and it's solid. It feels like it should probably have come out in late 93 rather than mid 95, but in its own right it's decent if unremarkable melodic ambient. Definitely one to check out if you've rinsed all the obvious places and are looking for something a bit more obscure. Biochip C Inside Chapter 2. Mellow, melodic, down-tempo acid. Nothing you've not heard before, but contains some decent compositions. Tupilaq, Alaskanlab, Sweden 1995. Very pretty ambient IDM from Krista Linder. As the title suggests, this is a chilly affair, but it's not the dark, intimidating IDM the UK have been producing, falling closer to the style of April Records' Boredom compilations in its gentle minimalism. Children of Dub, The Silent Pool. Psydub meets psychedelic rock, but with some wonderful sampling. Unafraid to throw in some breaks, trip-hop or house, and equally happy to have lengthy stretches of sound collage, and despite the name, surprisingly not that dubby. Alcove, Universal Implication. Pretty dark stuff with long, sinister drones and glitchy IDM, but also manages to surprise with several moments of remarkably lovely melodic sequences and melodies. A confusing album, but a highly atmospheric one. 7. Tell me your album comes from before the internet was widespread without actually telling me. The completely ungoogleable 7 is actually a one-off ambient project of the techno producer and DJ Thomas Franzman. Xylon, Moon Cafe. A very pretty mix of melodic ambient, Berlin School and down-tempo. Valleyman Herzhaeg. With the eye on the cover and its mix of ambient and tribal-hinged trancey techno, Valleyman's Herzhaeg sort of feels like a poor man's version of Robert Liner's Visions of the Past, which is maybe slightly unfair really, but it's a comparison that always comes to mind. The environmental ambient of On a Rowing Trip is a 1995 highlight, while the rest of the album falls into the second tier territory that's definitely worth checking out as long as you're not expecting a masterpiece. I just can't bring myself to love this one, but there's definitely a lot to like. Some of the compilation series carried on this year, many coming to an end. Jumpin' and Pumpin's Ambient Senses reached its final volume with the ludicrously named The Aroma. What does ambient smell like? Waveform pushed forward with Volume 2 of its ambient dub series. Trans-Europe Express released a 4th volume, albeit with very little ambient. Most interesting was Excursions in Ambience, the 4th Frontier, the last in Astral Works' series which, much like Virgin's final volume before it, and despite the cover art, made a concerted effort to move away from ambient house towards newer sounds featuring drone-based post-rock from the likes of Flying Saucer Attack and Lab Bradford. Tracks by Michine, Lunasol and Bill Neal feature straightforward ambient techno sounds, albeit dispersed by more experimental sound design and future jazz elements, while Single Cell Orchestra, Freezer and Node end things on an abstract note with 3 different varieties of minimalism and drone. 2 names are more familiar, System 7 under their US 777 alias with a warm and pretty ambient doodle, and FSOL here as Far Out Son of Lung with Cow, a track that surprisingly fits in more comfortably alongside the darker end of things, a tough hip-hop beat overlaid with various kinds of distortion and feedback, and a track that's startlingly unambient even for ISDN era FSOL. Easily the most impressive of the ambient compilation series, Excursions in Ambience ends with a very respectable set that looks both back at the past few years and forwards to where things might be heading. And on that note, we come to an end of 1995, a year which I began talking about how ambient was beginning to be on the wane, and then proceeded to talk on several more videos about how much ambient there was. Nevertheless, this was the last full year where this was a popular and common style, as you'll find out very soon when I head into 1996 on the next video. Before that though, I'd love to hear your comments. I would love to hear what you thought of this music, especially if you were there at the time, so please do drop me a comment below, and there are also like, subscribe and share buttons you might like to press as well. And for those of you who use Spotify, check down below in the video description, there should be a link to a Spotify playlist that accompanies this series of videos. I'll be updating that with all the material I cover every time a video comes out. And I hope you'll join me for 1996. I'll see you then.